young generation. Men of our time knew the truth and yet turned away. Turned away not only from the biblical truth, the religious truth of the Reformation, but turned away from the total culture built upon that truth, which included the balance of freedom and form which the Reformation brought forth in Northern Europe, in the state and society, a balance which has never been known anywhere in the world before. Having turned away from the knowledge given by God, man has now lost the whole Christian culture. In Europe, including England, it took many years. In the United States, only a few decades. Ours is a post-Christian world in which Christianity, not only in the number of Christians, but in cultural emphasis and cultural result, is now in the minority. To ask young people to maintain the status quo is folly. The status quo is no longer ours. Do not take this lightly. It is a horrible thing for a man like myself to look back and see my country and my culture go down the drain in my own lifetime. It is a horrible thing that 60 years ago you could move across this country and everyone, even non-Christians, would have known what the gospel was. A horrible thing that 40 to 50 years ago our culture was built on the Christian consensus, and now we are in an absolute minority. As Christians in this period of history, we are faced with some crucial questions. The first one being this: what should our perspective be as we acknowledge the post-Christian character of our culture? Now, who was this Christian scholar who shared these words? Do any of you recognize this gentleman? This was a man by the name of Francis Schaeffer, probably the most influential Christian thinker of the second half of the 20th century. Francis Schaeffer. This was from his book, Death in the City, written in 1969. 56 years ago, he said ours is a post-Christian world, and he was lamenting the direction that America had gone in his day and age. And so you ask the question, well, friends, if this is what the leading Christian scholar of the second half of the 20th century was saying about the United States and Western culture, how much farther has our culture fallen in the last 56 years? Right? I mean, if this is what Schaeffer was saying in 1969, how far have we gone? What exactly is the fruit of our post-Christian culture? And so we look, for example, at where we are today as a culture. We've seen 70 million babies aborted since 1973. We've seen same-sex marriage approved nationally by the United States Supreme Court. We see 20% of Generation Z today identify as LGBTQ. We see American youth identifying as transgender, doubling in the last 5 years, according to UCLA. Fortunately, that trend is plummeting in the last year, showing the social nature of a lot of what the transgender phenomenon is based on. But still, that's a huge percentage of American youth. 5% of Americans under 30 identify as non-binary today. We could go on. Roughly 40% of marriages today are ending in divorce, according to the CDC. 40% of U.S. children are born out of wedlock, according to the National Center for Health Sciences. 65% of U.S. adults today approve of cohabitation. Cohabitation is living with someone you're not married to. The Bible calls that fornication. 50% of U.S. Christians say casual sex between consenting adults is at least sometimes acceptable. Over 50% of sexually active adults, according to the CDC, will acquire an STD in their lifetime. Today, over 110 million Americans have an STD, and the CDC reports 20 million new cases annually. We could go on. 29% of the U.S. population currently has no religious affiliation. 59% of the U.S. millennial population and 34% of Generation Z has no religious affiliation. 47% of millennials believe it's wrong to evangelize, to share the Christian faith with a non-believer. And only 4% of Americans hold to a biblical worldview, according to a Barna survey of this year. Not just 4% of Americans, but he found only 9% of self-described evangelical Christians hold to a biblical worldview. 9% of evangelicals. So again, friends, we see just how far our culture has strayed from the founding values that we were based on, right? We see this secular anti-biblical agenda pressuring traditional Christian values on all fronts: the family, media, education, business, law, the church. And we could go on and on with statistics such as these. But the bottom line, when we look at our culture today, we look and we ask again this question: how did this happen? Well, here's what you need to understand here this evening. This is how it happened. Culture is simply worldview externalized. Okay? And what I mean by that is the culture around us is simply a reflection of who and what that culture believes in and values. Okay? Culture is simply worldview externalized. And so, for example, a worldview, if you're not familiar with that term, a worldview is the lens through which you view and make sense of reality. Every religion, every philosophy offers a worldview. Worldviews specifically seek to answer the three great questions of life. Where did I come from? What's the meaning and purpose of life? What happens when I die? So every person, every culture is rooted in a particular worldview, and the prevailing worldview of a culture will ultimately manifest itself in that culture's values. It will affect everything about that culture. The great theologian A.W. Tozer put it like this: the history of mankind will positively demonstrate that no society or people has ever risen above its religion. And man's history will show that no religion is ever greater than its concept of God. Now, this is what Dr. Tozer is saying here. What you think and believe about God tonight, okay? What you think and believe about God tonight, it will affect everything about your life. It will affect your value for human beings. It'll affect your basis for morality. It'll affect your standard of living, your meaning and purpose of life. What you think and believe about God is the most important thing about you. The Indian apologist, Christian apologist Vishal Mangalwadi, he says it like this: a people cannot be better than their gods. A people cannot be better than their gods. What you think and believe about God will influence everything about your life, and ultimately about your culture and your society. Okay? So, for example, if you open up your holy book, and in your holy book you find 109 times your God commanding you to kill Jews, Christians, and other infidels, what are you going to end up with? You're going to end up with Islamic terrorism, right? On the other hand, if you open up your holy book and you find your God telling you that honesty, integrity, stewardship, and hard work matters, what are you going to end up with in that case? You're going to end up with the Protestant work ethic, okay? Right? What a person or a people think and believe about God will ultimately manifest itself in their lives and in their culture. It is the most important part of your worldview. And so what we need to understand tonight is if a culture has a false view of God, or even the wrong God, that will have drastic consequences for a society. So again, how do we arrive at our post-Christian culture today? Well, the Apostle Paul tells us in Romans 1, 18 through 32. If you read Romans 1, 18 through 32, what we find there is Paul's diagnosis for the death of a culture. How do cultures die? Okay, that's what Romans 1, 18 through 32 is all about. How do cultures die? Paul was living in the midst of a dying culture when he wrote to the Roman people. The Roman Empire was falling at this time. Okay? And how do cultures die? Well, Paul diagnoses it. He tells us, number one, they suppress the truth in verse 18. Okay? So again, don't talk to me about truth. Don't talk to me about absolutes and right and wrong. We're going to suppress the truth. Okay? We're going to fly by sight. We're going to go our way instead of God's way. So we suppress the truth. Paul then tells us we exchange the worship of God for idols. Don't we see that taking place in our culture today? Right? We don't tend to worship little golden Buddha statues here in the United States. Some people do. But we sure have our idols, don't we? Right? Money, sex, power, materialism, body image, right? You can go on and on. We have all kinds of idols that we worship, and we exchange the worship of those idols for the one true God. Paul then says they exchange the truth of God for lies. And then they abandon natural relations for unnatural ones. They're women with women, they're men with men. Paul says they did not retain the knowledge of God. They ignored God's laws and encouraged rebellion against them. Again, this is Paul's diagnosis for a death of a culture. Does that not sound like what we see taking place in America today? Right? All across our country, people ignoring God's laws, and not only ignoring God's laws, but then cheering others on as they too ignore and rebel against the rule of law. And so Paul then tells us 3 times here in this passage, because of this, God gave them over, God gave them over, God gave them over. And what does that mean, friends? What does it mean for God to give someone over? What it means, if you look at the words of Jesus in Mark chapter 3, you'll find that to be given over is basically to commit the unforgivable sin. It's to blaspheme against God and to disregard the work of the Holy Spirit and his testimony and revelation so consistently and so repeatedly that there is no hope of forgiveness. And Paul says this is what happens to a decaying culture. They can rebel, they can exchange the truth of God for lies, they can worship idols instead of the true and living God, and ultimately God will say, okay, you want to do this? You want to go your way? I'm going to let you sleep in the bed you made. And God will give them over to their sin and their rebellion. And this is Paul's diagnosis for a dead and decaying culture. Now, let me explain how we came to embrace such depraved thinking in our culture today. In the 19th and 20th centuries, modern scientists and philosophers declared that God is dead. We got any philosophy students in here tonight? Anyone heard that quote before? Friedrich Nietzsche, right, famous German philosopher. Nietzsche declared God is dead. Now, Nietzsche, when he declared God is dead, he wasn't literally saying God has died. What Nietzsche was basically arguing was that human progress in human science and technology and medicine had advanced to such a level that we no longer need to believe in these superstitious fairy tales. We no longer need to appeal to some, mysterious deity to answer the questions that we can't figure out. We have become the masters of the universe. We have become gods ourselves. We don't need to appeal to God or the supernatural or the church to make sense of life anymore. And so that's what Nietzsche was saying when he declared God is dead. And so in the 19th and 20th centuries, there arose these two philosophies known as naturalism and humanism. Naturalism is the belief that there is no supernatural. Science is adequate to explain all of reality. And then out of naturalism arises the philosophy known as humanism. Some of you might have heard the term secular humanism. Humanism is the belief that because there is no God, and we're all the product of random chance events in the history of our cosmos, we're all evolved out of the slimiology descended from the apes, right? We then, humanity, we are the pinnacle of the evolutionary order. That means we are the masters of the universe because there's nothing greater than us, right? If we're the highest of the evolutionary order and there is no God, then we become masters of the universe. And what that means then is we get to determine what is right and wrong. We get to determine what is true. We get to make the rules. Okay? There's no greater authority than man. That's what humanism is. Now, it's important to understand here tonight, friends, these 19th century, 20th century philosophers and scientists, they never actually disproved the existence of God. What they did is they simply defined God out of existence a priori, which means before the fact. They said this, they said, look, if we can't put something into our three-dimensional box of science, if I can't observe it, if I can't experiment with it, if I can't see it and touch it, then it can't be real. All that's real is what we can put into our three-dimensional box of science and see and touch and experiment with. And since I can't do that with God, well, God doesn't exist. And so they ruled out the possibility of a creator God, and then they asked the question, where did we come from? Right? Now, friends, understand there's only two possible answers to that question. You are either the product of an intelligent designer, a creator, or you are the product of a whole series of random chance events in the history of our cosmos. Those are the only two possibilities. In fact, you can't even think of a third possibility tonight. We're either the product of a whole series of random chance events or we're the product of a designer or a creator. There's no third option. But here's what happened. They ruled out the possibility of an intelligent creator, a designer, and then they asked, where do we come from? And all you're left with are absurd possibilities, absurd answers like, well, we must have all evolved out of the same single-cell slimiology that arose from the inorganic soup 4.5 billion years ago, right? No matter how unscientific that idea is, no matter how irrational that idea is, it's all we're left with. Now, this is like, let me give you an illustration. This would be like going to math class on the first day of school. And on the very first day of school, your math teacher tells you there is no such thing as the number 4. Okay, the number 4 is just a figment of some fundamentalist imagination. Number 4 doesn't exist. And then you come back to school on the second day of class. And your math teacher asks you, what's your name?
Marie.
Marie, what is 2 plus 2? 5? 3? Right? It can't be 4 because we ruled out 4 a priori just yesterday, right? Friends, you see how absurd this is when you rule out answers before you ask the question. It's very fascinating. I've had the opportunity to lecture on intelligent design all over the world. A few years ago, my friend Sean McDowell and I, Sean McDowell is one of the leading Christian apologists today. He's one of my close friends. We did a mission trip together to UC Berkeley in California, spoke in the very same amphitheater that Frank Turek and Rob Schneider just spoke in last week. If you saw any clips on that on social media. We had a packed house that night, over close to 1,000 college students from UC Berkeley. I spoke for an hour, Sean spoke for an hour, and then we took an hour of Q&A together. And in my presentation, I was sharing some of the scientific arguments for intelligent design, and during the Q&A session, a graduate student in physics, he stood up and came to the microphone. He said, "Mr. Carlson, I don't care what you say, I'm still going to believe in evolution." I said, "Oh, okay." I rolled up my shirt sleeve. I had a wristwatch on that night. I said, "You see this wristwatch?" I went down to a junkyard, found a bunch of rusty, bent up, twisted pieces of metal. I threw them inside a shoebox and I started shaking. Shook it for an hour, shook it for a day, just kept shaking it. Shook it for a week, a month. Bam! All of a sudden, all the pieces flew together. Started ticking off 60 seconds a minute, 60 minutes an hour, 24 hours a day, telling the day and date, all by chance. Amazing! Well, guess what that graduate student of physics did? He laughed at me. He said, "That's impossible." I said, "Well, wait a minute. Do you mean to tell me that this watch by chance is impossible? And yet you'll tell me that this eye which sees in 3D and color with over 100 million rods and cones for black and white and color vision, right? You'll tell me that this eye, or my brain, this 3-pound brain greater than any computer on Earth, a 3-pound brain with 120 billion cells, 130 trillion electronic chemical connections, is all a product of chance?" As I said that night, I would submit to you, friends, it takes far more faith to believe in naturalistic evolution than it does to believe in a designer, a creator. All right? But this is what has happened. In the 19th and 20th centuries, we ruled out the possibility of a creator God, and all we're left with are these absurd ideas like naturalistic evolution, that somehow everything exploded into existence out of nothing, life arose from non-living matter, and we all evolved from the same single cell slimy algae. Okay, never mind, there's no scientific evidence for any of that, but it's all we're left with because we ruled out the possibility of a creator God. Now, here's what happened. These 19th, 20th century philosophers and scientists following secular humanism, their whole idea was, the modernist project was, if men and women were allowed to continue their evolutionary progression and continue to evolve in our education and our wisdom and our knowledge and our technology, they literally believed that we could create utopia on Earth. We could create a perfect society on Earth. But what took place, instead of creating utopia on Earth, man, divorced from God, created hell on Earth. And the 20th century was witness to the Great Depression and 2 great world wars and the Holocaust and the nuclear arms race, Pol Pot in the killing fields of Cambodia, Mao Zedong in China, Joseph Stalin in Russia, killing upwards of 50 million plus people, countless other atrocities. Historians have described the 20th century as the bloodiest century in the history of the human race. In fact, more people were killed in the 20th century by their fellow man than all previous centuries combined. And what we discovered is that man apart from God is not basically good, but the human heart is bent towards evil, greed, and great wickedness.